I wasn't exactly sure how to go about starting this video, but after thinking about what I could say to introduce Assault Spy, I decided the best way would be to simply just let it speak for itself. It should be fairly obvious that Assault Spy is a stylish, fast-paced action game, also known as character action, a term that many fans of games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta will be pretty familiar with, and by extension will know exactly what Assault Spy has in store for them. For a bit of background, Assault Spy was created by a single person known as Wazn, and was published by NIS America. I think what makes this game stand out is the fact that while there are a number of indie character action games that exist, it's only really the 2D games like The Dishwasher and Super Crush KO that actually feel good to play, while the 3D character action games from the indie scene never quite capture how they should feel. Assault Spy, however, is the first game, for me at least, to be an exception to this. This is partly due to the fact that its core combat is incredibly polished compared to its competition, but also due to the fact that its presentation really makes it feel like a full title. Despite the kind of game Assault Spy is now, its origins are actually rooted within a visual novel that came out in 2011. It seems like Assault Spy is some sort of loose adaptation of the original. There's not much I can tell you about this original visual novel, however, since only one website seems to have any information on it, and it's all in Japanese. What I can say though is that Assault Spy really benefits from the influence of this original game by using character portraits and art CGs for many of the game's cutscenes. Our story begins on an alternate timeline of Persona 3 in which our main character did not join Seize and awaken to his persona, but instead became an average salaryman who... What do you mean everybody already makes this joke? Ah, shit. Our story begins with Asaru Vito on the job as a corporate spy stealing information from some no-named company. We are then instantly introduced to Kaneko Yotsuba, Asaru's partner and shadowing apprentice, who very quickly reveals the kind of character she is by purposely setting off the building's security system. The game does a great job of establishing this double act within the first few seconds of meeting these two, with Asaru playing the straight man. Kaneko, on the other hand, is very much a love her or most likely hate her type of character, but personally I love the little shit. I mean, just look at her. She's perfect. After cleaving their way through several rooms of alerted animatronic office supplies, our duo is confronted by a fellow corporate spy, Kazuma, who offers to help the two by leading them to an escape route, only to instantly double-cross them by trying to steal the data the two had acquired, setting himself up as this game's rival character. Unfortunately for Kazuma, however, he kinda sucks. This is mainly due to him being a tutorial boss fight, as he does get harder in repeat fights later on in the game, but the power balance between him and the player is actually the opposite of what it usually is in these types of games. Despite receiving a thorough ass beating, Kazuma reveals his narcissistic boasts are not completely unwarranted, as he's able to swipe the disc from Asaru during the fight without him noticing, and escapes before anything can be done about it. We then hard cut to 2 days later, where Asaru and Kaneko are sitting outside in this seemingly abandoned city. Seriously, where is everyone? While Asaru is in the middle of watching training videos, he is suddenly interrupted by a call from his boss, who informs Asaru due to his slipping performance has only one last chance to keep his job. Our two anti-heroes are tasked with scoping out a worldwide security development corporation known as Negabot for future operations. and despite his objections, Asaru is reluctantly forced to agree to take Kaneko along with him. However, upon arriving, the two of them discover that the building has been completely overrun with its own security robots, which are attacking the employees and forcing them off the premises. Deciding to use all the commotion to his advantage, Asaru fights his way through the hordes of machines to make his way into the lobby. This is where we meet the two main villains of the Asaru campaign, the Glorious Mr. Showtime and his Ice Queen secretary Chidori, the two of which suddenly announce that they now own the company and that everybody is fired. They then send down more robots to deal with the employees still remaining in the lobby, which Asaru and Kaneko easily make short work of. The two are then approached by a hacked security robot being controlled by the manager of the company's technology department, Professor Irene Yaneda, who mistakes the two for agents of the CIA who have come to save the company from this hostile takeover. Despite not really knowing what's going on, Asaru decides to take this opportunity and use it to his advantage, and agrees to help the professor in the hopes that he can steal information from Negabot in the process. This is where the opening comes to a close and we really get into the main meat of the game. So this is where I want to talk about the game's combat. At least for Asaru. We'll get to Emilia, the other playable character, next. Asaru has a few tools of destruction, but his main one is his metal suitcase. However, it might as well just be Rebellion from the Devil May Cry series in cosplay due to how similar its moveset is. The animations may not look all the same, but the functions of Dante's basic toolset are all here. You've got your Stinger, your Billion Stabs, your High Time, your Prop Shredder, along with various other moves. And the way these attacks are inputted is actually very similar to the way that the DMC Devil May Cry reboot does it by having normal Hey, where do you think you're going? Get back here! So as I was saying, Asaru utilizes a normal attack button which he uses for combos and certain input attacks. And then he has his second special attack button which he uses for his Helm Splitter-like move and his launcher. Where Assault Spy differs is that instead of having moves done by double tapping forward or by locking on and holding forward, you can perform input moves by pressing attack after using the dodge/dash button, which can be done both on the ground and in the air, producing different attacks. A little ways into the game, Asaru will gain access to his umbrella, which he uses like a katana by executing draw techniques, resulting in this weapon having a lot of moves very reminiscent of the second son of Sparda, Virgil. However, the umbrella acts more like a heavy attack, with high damage in a wide range, but with a slow startup as a result. What is a little unusual is how health is handled in the game. Instead of having a more traditional health bar, you actually have 5 pips of health, with 1 going down after each hit, no matter what attack it comes from. Now this may sound like Asaru is nothing more than a combination between Dante and Virgil, and to a certain extent this isn't untrue. How Asaru differs from his two demon counterparts though, is due to his heavy use of what we call just frames. Being a businessman, Asaru is always expected to be on time, and you as the player will be rewarded if you are too. A just frame is when an attack is inputted on just the right frame of an animation, and when you input these attacks on just frames correctly, Asaru will perform a buffed version of the attack, with more damage, more impact, and potentially more properties such as it hitting multiple times or the attack coming out quicker than it normally would. These are actually a lot easier to execute than you would expect, and the game does a lot to try and help you learn the timings, like making Asaru glow blue on any moment he could perform a just frame, and making Asaru's weapons give off a white flash on the precise timing you need to input the attack. And I don't think the input requirement is actually a single frame, but actually several, meaning your timing does not need to be frame perfect. It seems difficult at first, but it's something you get into a rhythm with very quickly, and it's not much harder than getting the perfect hits in games like Spider-Man PS4 and the Batman Arkham games. The last few pieces of Asaru's moveset are his explosive business cards, his dual button inputs, and Kaneko herself. The business cards act as a simple projectile, and are fairly weak but can still be useful for extending combos or increasing your style gauge, while the dual button inputs allow for even more special attacks that usually involve both the umbrella and the briefcase. Finally, we have Kaneko herself, who is quite an interesting aspect to Asaru's arsenal. At first, the only thing she can do is use her incredible charm and wit to annoy and distract the enemies, pulling their attacks away from you and giving you some breathing room, before eventually going on a cooldown. However, after buying some upgrades, instead of using her as a distraction, Kaneko can teleport behind the enemy and deliver a single attack that will either launch or knock the enemy towards you, acting kind of like an assist striker in a fighting game. In the process of making their way to Professor Yaneda, our heroes are interrupted by Chidori and one of the company's new prototype security robots, Officer Diamond. A suit-wearing robot with a hardened briefcase just like Asaru's, which gives him a similar moveset as well. This is where we're introduced to the stun bar, a mechanic that all the bosses and some of the enemies from now on will share. All of your attacks will deal both health and stun damage. The boss naturally has reduced damage from all of your attacks and super armor, preventing them from flinching when you attack them. However, once you fully deplete the stun bar, you will guard break the enemy, taking away the defense buff and super armor, as well as dropping a health item beneath them, allowing you to restore any pips of life that you've lost during the fight. Guard breaking is a very important aspect of the boss fights, as it temporarily turns the boss into a combo punching bag, allowing you to really lay in the damage. Unfortunately, your fight with Officer Diamond is only brief, as Chidori decides that the encounter has been a good enough test of both Asaru and Officer Diamond's abilities. However, now with the coast being clear, we finally get to meet up with Professor Yaneda in person, to discover that over 60% of her is made up of latex-encased leg. Trust me, I did the math. Upon meeting her, our team receives a key card as the professor explains that the only way to get to Chidori and Mr. Showtime is by acquiring the 4 authorization codes, with each one being guarded by a different security officer robot, named after the 4 suits of cards: Diamond, Club, Spade, and Heart. With our duo now being a trio, the 3 go in pursuit of Officer Diamond, as the authorization machine is the closest one to them. Upon getting there, you are once again confronted by Officer Diamond, ready for a second round. However, this time, mid-fight, Professor Yaneda tosses a gadget over to Asaru. This is the Overclock watch, which essentially acts as this game's version of the Devil Trigger, Umbral Climax, Rage of the Gods mechanic. The Overwatch clock, however, does not increase the user's damage output, but instead increases their perception and speed dramatically for a short period of time. This is presented by not only slowing down time, but speeding up the user as well, to arguably an absurd degree, as Asaru becomes a little bit difficult to control when using the Overwatch clock. The first couple of times you use it, Asaru will slip and slide all over the place until you grow accustomed to what you can and can't do while using it. Alternatively, you can spend a small chunk of the overclock meter to perform an Azuna drop suplex if you can manage to get behind the enemy. After defeating Officer Diamond, the team acquire the authorization code and head back down to the main lobby, which now acts as a hub, allowing you to tackle the other 3 levels and officers whichever order you choose, in Mega Man style fashion. I think I'll leave it at that for Asaru's campaign, as while Assault Spy's story is hardly its strongest aspect, I don't think I should ruin what is there, and besides, this video doesn't need to be longer than it already is. So on that note, let's move to our other playable character, Emilia Smith, a gung-ho CIA agent sent from the fictional country of Mamerica, the creators of WuckDonald's and Pineapple Laptops, and she comes with just about every Japanese stereotype of a Mamerican you could think of. Emilia actually appears a number of times throughout Asaru's story, however only for very brief moments, most of which are reserved for spells of comic relief, as the majority of her screen time is saved for her own story. Emilia's campaign is a bit of an odd one. It seemingly has no connection to the first one, despite using the exact same levels and most of the same bosses. On top of this, despite the story being mostly the same, all of the characters act very differently and take on different roles within the story. For example, Asaru has been renamed to Mr. Assault, and is now the villain, with Kaneko still acting as his sidekick, or rather now his partner in crime. And in Emilia's campaign, it's these two who are the ones trying to take over Negabot, while Professor Yaneda is now sporting a new look under the guise of Agent Irene, who acts as the repeated rival boss fight in Emilia's story in place of Hazuma. Now, if Asaru's moveset is meant to be an homage to Devil May Cry, then you may look at Emilia's control scheme and think that she is meant to be one to Bayonetta, with individual punch and kick buttons with different finishes depending on what combination you put in. However, this doesn't really feel the case, as Emilia is her own beast, with her moves taking inspiration from characters from various different games, both within and outside the genre. While Emilia still receives a few different kinds of weapons, such as her bladed pistol and spear, however, her main way of kicking ass is by simply beating down her enemies, by infusing her punches and kicks with overcharged electricity. As Emilia lays into her enemies, she will begin to build up a charge meter that puts her into 3 different states of low, medium, and high voltage. The voltage will constantly drain when not attacking enemies. However, having higher voltage results in most of Emilia's attacks doing more damage. This constant tug of war with the voltage meter really encourages you to play aggressively, which really fits with Emilia's hot-headed attitude. Alternatively, she can cash out all the built-up energy to perform various charged super attacks, such as an electric haymaker, a power geyser, or she can pull out her Sunday best and fire her... Emilia also has her super mode, which is her equivalent to the Overclock watch, in which the voltage on her energy meter enters a 4th state, being very high, which boosts her damage dramatically, as well as giving her access to even more powerful versions of the power geyser and electric haymaker. Other than that, we have Emilia's spear and gun, which are both relatively minor aspects to Emilia's moveset. Her gun is very basic and simply works as a low damage projectile, however it does gain a few familiar tricks when upgraded. As for the spear, it's much like Asaru's umbrella, being a slower, heavy hitting weapon with decent range. Its moveset is much more limited, however it still has a few useful functions. After beating both stories, the player will unlock a 3rd and final episode, which is stitched on to the end of Emilia's route if you've already beaten Asaru's campaign. In this final chapter, you can switch between the 2 characters at a touch of a button, which is quite fun and also allows you to do all sorts of crazy combos, which is way beyond my skill level. While combat is definitely the main aspect of Assault Spy, it's not the only part of the game. For example, all of the levels have some very, very light platforming between combat encounters, and considering both of the characters are supposed to be spies, the game does throw a forced stealth section at you, which isn't great, but it's still better than you'd probably expect. It's identical on both routes, fairly short, and is really easy to cheese and blitz through, thanks to the enemies having extremely forgiving vision cones, and it's even skippable on repeat playthroughs. The only non-combat related side content is rescuing the 50 faceless Negabot employees that have been trapped within the building still. Rescuing them only requires you to find and talk to them, resulting in a small exchange between the employee and the player character. Then they disappear while giving you a small amount of upgrade currency. It's definitely beneficial to keep an eye out for them, especially on your first playthrough, but honestly, some of these buggers are pretty tricky to find, and getting all of them doesn't actually result in anything other than an achievement, so I wouldn't spend too much time trying to get them all. There are also a number of post-game options that unlock after beating the story, these being the hard and extreme difficulty modes which unlock after beating the game on the preceding difficulty, as well as the boss rush, death march, and spy must die modes. For each difficulty increase, enemies receive more health as well as increasing their aggressiveness in combat. The game also reduces the amount of health you have, giving you 4 pips on hard and 3 pips on extreme. On top of this, hard and extreme have remixed enemy placements for combat encounters, meaning you'll encounter mid and late game enemies much earlier on, and you retain all the abilities you acquired on your first playthrough, so you're still fully equipped to deal with them. Next we have Death March and Spy Must Die, which are both 54 gauntlets in which you must battle through various collections of enemies on each floor, with boss fights at select intervals. Death March is available right off the bat, and is essentially a compact version of the entire base game across all the floors, as you fight all the game's bosses as well as various enemy combinations. Basically, it's Devil May Cry's Bloody Palace mode. Spy Must Die, however, is a much more interesting endeavour, as it feels like some sort of weird dream match that separates the spies from the mail clerks, as the game puts you up against all sorts of wacky combinations, such as the first floor throwing 2 Officer Diamonds at you, and the 7th making you fight both Irene and Hazima at the same time. Due to the sorts of things it throws at you, Spy Must Die mode only becomes available after beating the game on extreme difficulty. And finally we have the boss rush mode. It's a boss rush. That's it. Whoa, actually, not finally. Craft from the future here. There was actually a patch that came out for Assault Spy while I was working on this video. The patch did a number of things, such as fixing a few bugs and whatnot, as well as tweaking some of the attacks for better balancing throughout the game. It even added a few new hidden moves for both Asaru and Emilia, like Asaru getting a new follow-up to his functional million stabs being an actual million stabs, and Emilia getting a new launcher that's very useful for her moveset, as well as a few other moves. However, one of the biggest additions to this patch was a new hidden boss fight was added. After beating the game on hard work mode, you unlock a new question mark icon. This is where you can fight the human embodiment of an aneurysm, also known as Kaneko. If you're somebody who hates Kaneko, you can now take Solstice in the fact that you can beat the absolute crap out of her. That is to say, if you're able to. She's definitely not the hardest boss in the game, but she certainly is tricky and has a very, very large stun bar. So yeah, that's something to look forward to. Anyway, back to the original video. Okay, so there was actually a second patch that came out while I was making this video. Most of it was bug fixes, but there was a few things I didn't want to leave out. Emilia has a new move that allows her to put down a ball of electricity when pressing the punch, kick and gun buttons all at the same time. I'm not sure whether or not this was added in the previous patch, but I only noticed it after the second one. The other major thing added to this patch is cel-shaded like black outlines added to the character models. This doesn't do an awful lot, but I do feel like it does improve the visuals ever so slightly. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about the game's presentation in a bit. Now that I've talked about all the main aspects of the game, I want to talk about Assault Spy's general presentation and polish, which is an area I feel the game lacks in a number of ways. The worst offender being Assault Spy's art style. Despite being filled with crazy action, quirky characters and a wacky sense of humour, the art style honestly feels incredibly stale and devoid of much life or colour, which you could say is to represent the boring office job of a Japanese salaryman. However, this doesn't make the game's visuals any less boring to look at, as 90% of the game's colour palette is made up of white, black and grey. The only respite you really get is during the game's visual novel cutscenes, which uses various portraits and the occasional CG art, which all look great and really expressive, which when paired with the voice acting really goes a long way. Unfortunately, the character art is not very well translated to the 3D models. I think the best way to illustrate my point is to look at the game's key art and compare it to this promo image, which looks dead and soulless in comparison. However, I would like to reiterate that this game was made by a single person, so stuff like this is very understandable. However, it's not all bad though, as this game does use Unreal Engine 4, which has a lot of different effects and such built into it, which means Assault Spy sports some very nice motion blur, among other things. On top of this, there are also things like the game's enemy designs, which I actually like quite a lot. To help fit in with the game's 9 till 5 salary job aesthetic, most of the Negabot robots consist of various weaponized workplace items, like bladed Roombas or drones with a shotgun tied to them, which I do think is a really cute and fun design idea. However, because of this, I do feel like a lot of the enemies rely a bit too much on long-ranged attacks, especially in the early game. Another area of the game that can be somewhat lacking is with its polish, as Assault Spy can be very temperamental in places, with bugs both big and small. A lot of these are relatively harmless, such as being able to move around still when entering the upgrade menu. However, there are a few that are a bit more problematic, such as getting stuck inside the elevator that takes you between floors in the Spy Must Die and Death March modes. There can also be occasional moments of fairly heavy slowdown in certain areas of the game. It's a pretty rare occurrence, but it can still happen on even relatively beefy computers. The last thing that needs to be mentioned in terms of the game's presentation is its music and sound. The soundtrack of Assault Spy matches the rest of the game, in the sense of there's not much of it, but it's still quite good. The composer of the OST is Takehiro Iguchi, who has worked on various Ridge Racer games, as well as being one of the people who worked on the soundtrack to the anime No Game No Life. The music is all very high energy with a mixture of electronic and rock music, which makes it an excellent fit for an action game like this. On top of this, a good amount of the tracks really stand out, with my personal favourites being Heroic Salaryman, Enter the Agent, and Showtime Showdown. I will say, however, that due to the mixing, sometimes the sound effects will drown out the game's music, as well as some of the dialogue during boss fights. This made me feel like the music wasn't all that notable until I went back and listened to it after my first playthrough, so something I'd suggest is going into the game's options and turning down the sound effects in the audio settings, which is honestly something I do with action games with good soundtracks like Devil May Cry and Ys anyway. if only a little bit. In closing, Assault Spy is a game that knows exactly what it wants to be, and despite an assortment of nicks and scratches, it manages to pull that off extremely well. It hasn't got the largest scope, but it's definitely a fun and silly romp, and it will easily keep you entertained for at least 10 hours with the game's 2 main campaigns. I'd like to thank Wazan and the QA team at NIS America for making this game possible, and I hope they continue to polish it. Now, I don't want to be a port beggar, but I think that the PS4 and the Switch would be really good consoles to release on, just saying. In all seriousness though, the game did come out at the back end of 2018, and it was kind of buried by the surplus of excellent major releases that came out that year. I get the impression that there's a lot of people out there that would be interested in this game, but they simply just don't know that it exists. Which is part of the reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place. I just hope that it gets the word out to at least a few more people, as I've seen very little buzz around this game. And if Steam Spy is anything to go by, it didn't sell particularly well either. I've always been a huge advocate of niche games, and I'd really hate it if people overlooked Assault Spy without realising, as while it is a little rough in places, I truly do believe it is a hidden gem. If you're still watching, I'd like to thank you for putting up with me for this long. This video has been a really long time coming, and I'm really glad that I've actually managed to finish it now. When I first started this project, I had no idea what I was doing, and I've learnt so much over the course of everything. And while I'm still not great, I think I'm significantly better in front of a microphone now. The entire recording process was suffering. So yeah, any and all feedback would be really appreciated, so I'd love it if you could tell me what you liked or disliked about the video in the comments below. I'd also like to thank all the friends that I would constantly pester with updates on how this video was going, especially Taylor, who has his own YouTube channel called The Gaming Shelf. I've been subscribed to him since his Tales of Xillia 2 review back in the day, and it was really nice to have somebody who knew what they were talking about to answer all of my stupid questions. As for what I might do next, I'm not too sure. I might play around with different ideas or experiment with my videos to see what I like doing more, but I'm not really too sure. What I will say is that my favourite genre is JRPGs, and Japanese games in general really, and these are some of my favourites. So if you like these sort of games, then maybe I'll have a video in the future that you'll enjoy too. I look forward to doing more, so yeah, thanks.